As you've been developing in Bubble, you've probably noticed this pesky error that shows up at the top of your page. It says, "We just updated this page. Please refresh the page to see the latest version." You won't be able to see it until your next refresh. But what exactly does that mean? So part of the reason that you're seeing this message is because you're making changes in what is called your test environment. Now, when you're building a program, typically you're operating in two different, you can think of them as environments or spheres, or basically anything that helps you to distinguish. You have two very identical but different worlds. So when you're building an application, you have your test environment, which is where you're making changes to your application, where you're developing and refining what the application will look like. But what you do in test is going to be different than what your users see. So your users are going to be working in your production environment. So it's what recognizes a specific state of your application. So when you're making changes to your application from the editor within Bubble, what happens here isn't necessarily going to impact your users in production. So of course, for your users, you want to be able to grow and develop and test and refine features before you actually go to launch them with your users. So how exactly does that come about? How do you launch something to your users? Well, first off, it's good to get your bearings to know where exactly it is that you're operating within Bubble. So right now I have an editor for this application up, and this is just a simple short linking application that I've built. And at current, I haven't actually deployed this to live. So if we go out, if I were to go to the URL of this application, just as it is within Bubble, so it's fwd.bubbleapps.io. If I go to that and try to access the live version of the application, I'm going to see this message. And this message is because I haven't actually deployed my app for the first time yet. So if an end user is trying to access my application, they're not going to see anything. And one of the key ways to remember what is the difference between your test environment or your development environment and your live, or what you can call your production environment, is that your test environment includes version test at the end, and your live version does not. So that little modifier of version test is what Bubble uses to reroute your application to the right place. So if I were to go over to version test, and just got that long URL because of some of the test work that I was doing there. But now notice when I go to version test, I don't see that message. So because this is part of my live application. Now, first, how do we actually go about deploying to live for the first time? So part of accessing that is this button up here that says development. So with this toggle button here, when I click on it, I have two options, one that says development and one that says live. And right below that, I have an option called development and version control. We'll come back to that in just a second. But what happens when I click on live here? So when I click on live, what this is going to do is to take me into a read-only version of that production environment. Why is it read-only? Well, simply enough, because this is something that you've pushed to your users. And this is just your way of seeing the application how they currently see it. So if you were to push your development application without to live, then those two things are going to match up one-to-one. But the second you start making changes in your development environment, you're going to have something that's a little bit different than your production environment. So this is a way for you to see and know what your users are currently seeing in your application. And as well within that, you can explore from the app data tab, seeing what things are like for given users in your application, and really getting into debugging from that user standpoint. So, but generally speaking, you're fairly restricted in what you can do from a live perspective in your application. So let's go ahead and switch back over to development. So when I switch back over to development, one of the things that we can explore now is to say that we want to push this application to live. So how we do that is we go to this button that says deployment and version control. So the first thing that we're going to see here is, because we haven't ever pushed this application to live before, it's going to say you haven't deployed this app to live yet, which was confirmed by that message that we saw when we actually tried to preview the live version of the application. So when we want to do that, we hit this button that says deploy development to live. And what it's going to do when we hit that button is to give us a couple of prompts for things to think about. And just at a very high level, what this covers is the concept of privacy roles within your application. So that's setting up roles for the actual restriction of database information based on certain permissions. And that's something that I'll explore in another video. It's an incredibly important topic, but not something that we're going to delve into too much within this given video here. So let's go ahead and just click got it for now. And what we're going to be prompted to do is to give a description to what it is that we are actually doing here. So what I might say is, since this is the first version, I'll call this v0.1 initial launch of the link forwarding tool. Okay, and then when I hit deploy, what that's going to do is to actually make this application, as it currently exists in development, available to my end users. So now let's see what happens when we go to our just base URL for this application. So now we no longer see that message. So of course, because the way that this application is structured, there's not actually anything on this index page here. But for the purposes of our application, you see that message is no longer here. So we've successfully deployed our application to live, which is a great thing. So now every time that we want to push changes to our app, simply enough, all we do is we go to deployment control, and we hit deploy development to live, give it a description, and then hit deploy. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that it's much better to not use this button every time that you're making just one simple change. Why is that? Because for all of your end users, you're going to be pushing them an update to say that they have to refresh their page. But also, it's good to have the development practice of saying, we're going to bundle things up, we're going to test, we're going to validate, and every time that there's a simple change or we notice some sort of bug, we're not just going to do a deployment fix, but rather we're going to get into the habit of really testing things before we release. So, but now you know how to push something to production. Now, let's say that you noticed an issue in your application and you actually want to roll things back. Bubble gives you some really great features in order to do that. So what you can do is to revert to a prior version of the application. Now, this is something that you should use very sparingly. So if it's just you notice some kind of bug within your application and you want to roll back to a certain time, you can certainly do that. I recommend doing this only when there is a critical issue in your application and you have live users and you want to roll back to a state where everything was functioning well, or you're working in a purely development environment. So one of the other good things that you can do if you're ever doing some really heavy lifting in your application is you can just make a copy of it from your Bubble dashboard. But otherwise, if I did want to revert to a previous time, of course, this works a little bit better when you have a number of past deployments. But let's just, for the sake of example here, we'll call this v0.2 secondary changes. So now you'll see in my deployment and version control that I have prior versions listed here. And what I could do is say, it's like, at the initial launch, I knew everything was working perfectly. So I can go back to copy time and revert to this time. And so easy enough to do that, actually a little bit too easy. But As you do that, Bubble is going to roll things back from a structural component within your application. And it's important to remember that this is rolling back the structure, but not necessarily the data. So if you want to roll back the data within your application, then you do that from within your data console within Bubble. But so, of course, as you roll things back, though, if you've made changes to your database model, then those fields aren't necessarily going to be reflected. And that's one of the reasons why I say you should use this tool very sparingly. So, otherwise, as you continue to develop your application, it's a great idea. Use deployment control as a very sparing feature versus deploying every time you make a single tweak. But it's good. Keep a clean development workspace. Make sure that you're keeping track of what are the changes that you're making between one version and the next, and remembering that difference between operating in your development environment and working in your production environment. Hope you found this video helpful, and happy building.